Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon. I've been investing in property for over 20 years, and if you're an active landlord or planning your next property investment, this podcast is for you. If you enjoy this episode or get something from this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could tell a couple of other property people about the Business of Property podcast. Telling others really is the best way to help podcasts grow, and I would very much appreciate you doing that. Today, I'm going to talk about the real costs involved in doing my own tenant finding, that process and what it involves, and ultimately answer the question of whether it's worth it. I'm going to talk about the cash, money cost that's involved, and also the cost of my own time. And obviously the time is really the bulk of the sort of investment, the cost of actually working through your own tenant finding process. So I will sort of attempt to compare that to sort of an alternative of using an agent. And hopefully between these things, we can work out whether it's a worthwhile investment to actually do your own tenant finding, at least for me anyway. So diving straight in with the cash costs, because they're the simpler, easier ones to look at. And in my case, this is advertising. So I use OpenRent typically, £49 for the sort of standard package that they offer to get it onto all the major portals. There was a recent sort of episode where OpenRent and Rightmove fell out, and they perhaps weren't going to be advertising on Rightmove for a while. So I did for a while sort of consider alternatives, and there is one, there's a company called Visum that have a package for £89, which does include all the major portals, including Rightmove. So perhaps that would have been the sort of next best. However, OpenRent and Rightmove have made up, and OpenRent is advertising on Rightmove again. So that's still probably the option of preference for me. Then involved in the process is referencing, and this has a cost as well. And I, again, use OpenRent for this at the moment, or have in the past, and they charge £20 per tenant. So on a typical tenancy, that might be a couple of adults, so that might be a £40 cost. The other cost I'll mention here is PATMA, which costs £15 per month for PATMA Property Manager. And I do use that as a system, and that is very much part of this process, although it isn't a single cost for the process, because it is an ongoing subscription to that service. There is also one other tool that I used in this process, and I'm not going to give a specific cost for that, because there are sort of free alternatives that could be used instead. And that, in this case, is SavvyCal. And that I used for helping me schedule some things, specifically viewings. And I already had an existing subscription to this service, so that was why I used that. However, there are free alternatives, perhaps in cal.com or in Google Calendar if you're using that. So you don't actually need the subscription service and the subscription cost to be able to do basically the same thing. And that's it really with costs. You could perhaps want to include professional photography as a cost if this was the first time you were doing this, first time you were marketing a particular property. However, the properties that I have photos for already, so at least unless there's a major change, there isn't really an extra cost there. So I'm not going to include that in these calculations on this occasion. So moving on to time costs. Now, I record all my time. 24/7 for nearly 10 years now. I have recorded every minute of every day and at least approximately what I'm doing. So I can tell you that the time that I state at the end of this section is pretty accurate. I'm quite happy to stand by that the time figure in this episode. I'm going to list the main things that I spent time on, just to provide you with an idea of what's involved and a bit of an overview. This is not an exhaustive list, though, and I'm also not really going to go into detail about the individual items. It really is just a list to give you an idea, a flavour of things. I'm also not going to break down how the time was spent between these things, although I will mention that some of them were quicker or longer or whatever, sort of relatively speaking, but I'm not going to give individual details on the different things in this episode, because I want to keep it relatively short. You can go back to episode 221 if you want, where Stuart and I covered a sort of discussion around tenant finding and some of the sort of things that were involved in that in a bit more detail. So if you do want more detail, there is that episode as an option. So the list of what's involved in my tenant finding process and the time total that I've got for you in this. So creating the advert. So as I mentioned, I already had photos. And I also had text from a previous advertising this property that I'm using as my example here. But I still needed to update it a little bit, put it back together, put it into OpenRent again, and actually get that advertising purchased and online. That was relatively quick, though. Reviewing and replying to tenant inquiries. Now, this is quite a time sink. This does take quite a lot of time to actually do, especially when a lot of those inquiries are well, varied in quality, perhaps I shall say. So it does take a bit of effort and a bit of back and forth with some inquiries in order to work out whether they're actually really a feasible tenant for your property. Arranging block viewings. So this involves talking to current tenants to schedule things. It involves talking to prospective tenants to again schedule them within the sort of block that you have available. As I mentioned, I use an online scheduling tool to help with that. So the actual sort of picking out of time slots within the block that I had arranged with the current tenants was kind of automated. So this I think could be quite time consuming if you didn't have some technology help in there. But with the technology, it's really not too bad at all. Then, of course, it takes time to attend those viewings. And it's all in a block, so it's not too much in the way of travel and back and forth and sort of sorting bits out around that. But the actual block viewing is probably for a few hours and does obviously take that amount of time. After the viewings, I'd spent a reasonable amount of time thinking about the tenants that had come along, and particularly about the ones who had then followed up and made an offer to take on the property and the tenancy. And in this particular example, there were multiple offers made after the viewings. And I had to think about how to proceed with those. Do you draw names out of a hat? Do you try and guess which ones might work out best or whatever? So I spent a while sort of thinking about and working out how to choose and proceed with that. There's then some communications for referencing and actually getting the referencing process started and sort of data entered into the referencing system, and then, of course, reviewing the references that come back. And a slight aside, on this particular example occasion, the first tenants that went through referencing did actually fail that referencing. And I had to go back and pick up another tenant from the initial viewing. Thankfully, they were still looking and they were still keen and had to go through referencing again. So in actual fact, in this particular case, while I don't think this happens very often, it's not sort of the normal really, my referencing costs were actually doubled. So I put 2 pairs of tenants through referencing. So rather than the £40, it was actually the £80. It was actually £80 in total for that referencing cost. And of course, there was a lot more time involved in going through that and recommunicating with the other tenants and following up and starting the process again. Then as you've got everything confirmed and you're then sort of arranging dates when old tenants move out and new tenants can move in, and whether there might be any cleaning or work or anything else that needs to be done in between those two. So there's a bit of sort of arrangement there. And of course, you're then sorting out the new tenancy sort of process. So you've got a lot of documentation to send to your new tenants, especially around all the compliance requirements. Thankfully, this is very, very fast, and it's only a few clicks because it's all built into Patma. And this is one of the main reasons why I use Patma. And it really helps guide and manage that process and make sure all the documents are all in the right places at the right time and sent out to tenants. Generating the AST, again, all built into Patma. It's very quick, very easy process. There's e-signatures to handle all of the signing involved with the tenancy and the contract. And of course, that keeps the time involvement really down to a minimum. Part of the process is also having an up-to-date inventory. So again, this is all built into Patma. There's the past inventory still in there, so I can just copy that over, make updates, update any photos that need to record new sort of marks or anything else. And again, all the e-signatures are handled within Patma. So that sort of compliance and documentation side of it does have to be done, and there is some reading to be done and some updating of things, but it is very streamlined and actually doesn't really take much time at all. The sort of last few bits are all about the handover process. And of course, you need to visit the property and meet the old tenants to handle their checkout process and them handing the keys back and things like that. And then you have to do it again, probably on another day, to meet the new tenants and handle their check-in process and giving them the keys and what have you. And then there's also a little bit of follow-up, notifying the council and utilities and things about the changeover and the new tenants and things, and possibly landlord responsibility for any void period and things like that. In this particular case, there was no void period, but you still have to, well, it's still a good idea to notify these people about the new tenants. And again, Patma makes that a couple of clicks, so it's super, super easy, very simple to do. And of course, the main thing that you're here to know is the actual cost, the time cost. And for all of that process, and it was spread out over a few weeks, but the actual time that it cost me was 28.1 hours. So basically 28 hours to accomplish all of that. And now that sounds like quite a big number to me. So of course the question is it worth it? Or was it worth it in this particular scenario, in this particular example? So I work for myself, and hence my own day job is very flexible. So I didn't need to worry about sort of being able to fit it in around other things much. Although having said that, in this particular case, I think most of the time was really spent in evenings and certainly weekends, not least because that's when others are available for things like viewings and moving home, but also because that was when it was easiest for me to be looking through the tenant inquiries and handling responses to them and things like that. So I think it could be done around most sort of office hours type jobs. I don't think that would really cause a problem. And certainly for me, that was actually mostly how it ended up, even though it didn't have to be. Looking at the alternative, what would this have cost me if I hadn't put this time in? Now, looking at a couple of local agents, the sort of tenant find service that they offer for properties in this area, including setting up the tenancy and things like that, it looks like it would have cost around £2,000, maybe a little bit under, but around £2,000. Possibly with a bit more if there are extra fees in the small print that I haven't actually read. So I think £2,000 probably a reasonable sort of estimate for what it would have cost if I'd used an agent for this process. And it's worth saying that I don't think that process would have been without the cost of my time. I would still have needed to spend some time sorting out paperwork for them and sorting out other details for them, and quite possibly sort of jumping into little bits of the process. So I don't think it would have taken my time involvement from 28 hours down to 0 or anything like that. There still would have been some hours there, I'm sure. So if we take my cash costs I mentioned earlier on, and we subtract them from that £2,000, that would give us about £1,850 left to be the value of my time. And if we divide that out by 28 hours, we get to about £65 per hour for the time that I spent. So is that good or not? Well, I have been charged out for my time at a much higher value than that in the past, but it's certainly not a terrible hourly rate by any means. And I think that really it probably is worth it just looking at that. And then there's also a hidden value in doing this yourself as well. And that's really around actually meeting your prospective tenants. And so probably applying a bit more thought and selection to that process than an agent might. I mean, I'm sure there are some agents who really do care about finding the best tenant that they possibly can for your property. But I think more often than not, an agent really is there to find a tenant for your property, not necessarily the best. And you can, as your own self-managing landlord, really apply a bit more thought and process to it. So overall, do I think it's worth doing this myself? Yes, definitely. Yes, it took 28 hours spread over a few weeks. So it's not that many in any single week or at any single time. And when you work it all out, that time was effectively being paid or had the value to me in saved spending of about £65 per hour, or £1,850 in total. Could I have done something else better with that time? Maybe, but I think I would rather spend it on this, save the money, be more confident in the tenants that I'm getting in, and overall, I'm happy with making that choice and going forward with continuing to find my own tenants, certainly wherever I can if I'm local enough to the properties, and feeling that is a worthwhile investment of my time and money. So please do let me know whether you think I'm right, or whether you have a different perspective, or you feel I've missed something in my sort of consideration and calculation of whether this is worth it or not. You can always contact me on show@thebusinessofproperty.com. Before I finish up, I just thought I'd give you another quick roundup of the tools that were involved to remind you. So these tools, I think, really are critical to helping make this process work at all. And they are OpenRent for providing advertising and the referencing system. They are PATMA for managing the whole compliance and documentation process that's involved and making that really fast and streamlined. There was SavvyCal, which helped me with the scheduling, although there are free alternatives with cal.com and Google Calendaring. And the one I haven't actually mentioned by name yet, which was Toggle, which is TOGGL, which is my time tracking tool, which, while it didn't really help with this process, it very much helped with providing the information for this episode and the information to know whether this process and this example was worth the time spent on it or not. Links to all of those tools will be in the show notes, along with a link to the previous episode as well that I also mentioned earlier on. And I will talk to you again next time.